is the third quarter report from the group and our council itself. And to lead this off, I will ask Karuna to introduce the item.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair, and kia ora, everyone. So this morning we'll provide an update on the performance for the Auckland Council Group and Auckland Council for the 9 months to 31 March 2022. On the call today we have Ross Tucker, who will cover off the group results, and Nicola Mills will cover off the Auckland Council parent results. Following this, we do have Jazz Singh, GM Procurement, and Taryn Crew, GM Community Facilities, who will be providing an update on labour and material cost trends, impacts for our capital program and our procurement strategy around this. I'll then provide a brief summary on our performance measure highlights, and we will close off with Ian Smallburn, GM Resource Consents, to talk about the work program the team have developed. So Ross, handing over to you to kick off with the group results. Thank you.
Thanks, Karuna. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the context for the third quarter, it was an unusual quarter. It's following on from a number of unusual quarters before that. So the story for the second quarter of the year was one about lockdowns. Things changed. So if you think about the third quarter, that's January through to March, we were out of lockdowns. We started off in the orange light, but quickly went to red. So it was a quarter where Omicron emerged. So less about lockdowns, but still lots of disruption because of the restrictions at red and orange light, and also we started to feel the impact of illness, absenteeism, tight labour markets, all those kind of things. So it was an area where people started to get sick. People started to change their behaviour again because Omicron emerged. So it created illness, people wanting to stay isolated, not gather, not go and attend our facilities, and some facilities closed over that period. That it was combined with some of the broader economic impacts that have started to come through into our numbers. So that's inflation, higher inflation and interest, broader supply chain disruption, and general labour shortages. So those are kind of all of the challenges that have impacted on the council group results for the 3 months to March, and therefore the overall year-to-date picture for the 9 months to March. So what does that mean for the council group? I mean, revenue challenges. So less activity, less people coming to events and using facilities, less people on public transport has all hit revenue. As we've projected through the recovery budget, those challenges have again persisted and created impacts on the numbers. It's increasing cost pressure, particularly on CapEx projects. And that is also, the supply chain disruption has also led to lots of delays in the construction projects, both from supply chain issues and unable to get labour and materials, but also the illness factor from Omicron. So all of that hit our CapEx delivery quite significantly in the third quarter. So that's kind of the context. If we go to the next slide, please. In terms of CapEx delivery, so we delivered 1.48 billion in the 9 months through to March across the group. That compares to a plan of just under $2 billion. So that was, compared to the same period last year, 250 million less, and it was 74% of budget compared to 91% the year before. So that is the impact of lockdowns hitting last calendar year, plus this ongoing impact of Omicron and supply challenges. So it's still a lot. It's still $1.5 billion. Is not a small amount. We were able to make quite a bit of progress on some key things that included more work on the Waikato water projects, both the drought, the 50 millilitres per day drought project and the boost pump, and some lots of other things in transport space. West Coast road safety improvement is one of them. So we got a lot of things done and delivered, completed. Progressed a bunch of other things, but at a slower rate. So some of the things that were delayed, being stormwater asset renewals, the work smart property stuff, the central interceptor project is delayed, behind schedule. Some of the other replacement things in the water care space, Matakana Link Road and Ports of Auckland automation project is kind of further delayed because of all the disruption. So it's a period of a substantial amount and some good progress in the circumstances, but a lot less than we previously projected. If we go to the next slide, please. So looking at operating financial performance, so direct revenue was in line with budget, and the direct expenditure was slightly favourable to budget. So on the revenue side, we did see some further hits to revenue, public transport, parking revenue down, and community facilities and events, so less people on buses and trains, less people coming into facilities. But on the other hand, we have seen further strength in the construction sector, and those water connection charges have continued to outperform budget. So you've kind of got activities with less people using council services being offset by some of that the water care infrastructure growth charges to be neutral overall. On the operating expenditure side, it was favourable to budget, and that is largely because because of the disruption, less things were done. So some work was deferred and reduced, particularly maintenance projects. Some work programs were delayed in getting started or have been put off. And then there's because we have some facilities closed, some events cancelled, that does reduce some of the costs associated with those as well. So overall, 81 million or 4% underspend on the OPEX space. We go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the people space, so obviously health, safety, wellbeing remains a focus. We have there's been a lot of very challenging environment in the people space, dealing with not just lockdowns and restrictions, but illness and absenteeism, etc. What we have seen is quite a number of extra FTEs come in, 443 extra year to date across the group. So some of that is filling vacancies, so kind of work we had planned to do, but it's been hard to find people. A lot of it relates to more people to do new things, things in the climate space, things that we need to do related to Three Water reform, in the port space, more people, more stevedores to unload ships, etc. So we've got filled vacancies. We're doing more in the climate space. We've had to deal with some of these things. Some of it has been taking on people in areas which has money, which has a revenue or an efficiency benefit. So things like in ports of Auckland, more people to do more activity helps revenue supporting activities. Some of it is in the water care space. There is work on account maintenance and revenue assurance. So more people to make sure we're getting more of the revenue coming through. There's also some temporary things, summer interns and things like that flowing through into the numbers. And we've filled some vacancies in the zoo, maritime museum, some digital project, and again some climate change roles. So it's a whole bunch of things. There's no one specific driver, but it's largely more people to get more work done. And in some spaces, it's to either do things that are imposed on us by government, or things that are going to create more revenue, or things that will ultimately lead to saving some money. So that's the picture of the people. We go to the next slide. Okay, at this point, I'll hand over to Nicola to go through the council, Auckland Council parent performance.
Morning, Nicola.
Good morning. Good morning. So Ross has covered, well canvassed the challenges that we've faced, and of course these applied to the parent as well during the quarter. So first we'll have a look at the capital performance. It remains well behind budget, but I've tried to pull out some good news stories about our capital delivery for you. We delivered 84 million in Q3, and that was actually the highest this year, and it was also higher than last year's Q3. So I think that's showing a good upward trend, albeit coming off, a difficult situation. The projects that were completed in the quarter, a lot of renewals of facilities, so toilets and changing room upgrade at Meadows Farm, renewal of pathways and the car park at Victoria Park, the seawall at Waiataiki Reserve, and the play areas in Noel Reserve. If we take a look at the operating performance, next slide please, thank you. So our financials continue to paint a favourable picture. We have the strong consenting volumes and therefore the fee revenue relating to that, and that is continuing to offset the lost revenue from the facility closures that we've had throughout the year to date, and also the lower visitation levels. We also received an unbudgeted dividend from the Ports of Auckland of $4 million. Our costs continue well below budget as well, with savings, in some cases, reduced maintenance because of the closed facilities, so you don't need to clean them when they're closed, for example. And our staffing, excuse me, our staffing levels lower than we had budgeted for as well, which Ross mentioned, the vacancies. And we are also, as we face delays in the capital program, we have delays to operating programs as well. So some of our natural environment programs, climate change programs, for example. But that underspending, of course, has been helpful in reaching our savings goal. If you can go to the next slide, please. So we are now, as at the end of March, we had achieved 83.5 million, or 93% of our goal. So we are well on the way to achieving that target for the current year. We continue through this kind of Omicron affected times to review carefully our actual expenditure compared to what we had budgeted, and that is where we are finding savings across a range of areas. So that's come through in things like printing, lower printing costs, courier costs, the lower repairs and maintenance I mentioned before, lower catering expenditure, and lower staff related costs like travel and training and salaries and wages, as we continue to struggle to fill some of those vacancies. And the fact that capital projects are delayed also means that the related operating expenditure is not needed. So, for example, if a facility doesn't open when we had expected it to, then we don't have to pay any utilities that we might have budgeted for. So all of that is adding up to the savings that we're achieving in the current year. And as I said, we have a high level of confidence that we will achieve the 90 million this year. There does remain a $38 million gap for next year's target, and that is challenging to find those savings that are going to make an ongoing impact. I will hand over now to Jazz Singh, our GM of Procurement, and Taryn Crew, our GM of Community Facilities, who are going to talk about what we're seeing in terms of material and labour cost trends.
Thank you, Nicola. In terms of our activity and what we've done in the market recently, since the last update, we've worked with Auckland Transport and a third-party provider to help us identify exact cost trends in the market based on our spend profile, that is Auckland Council as well as Auckland Transport, segment that into spend categories, and then try and see what some of those drivers are in each of those categories. And we've modelled that out across our CapEx program, and we've also got an idea of how it affects our OpEx costs as well. And then using that, try and identify some of the mitigations or mitigating actions that we will take to ensure that we can deliver against some of our capital program. One of the things that we do expect to see is that there will be a cost impact in the FY23 year of around 17%, which is a large increase, but we expect to see that flattening off after that as well, which I'll show you through some of the graphs shortly. Next slide, please. So just a reminder in terms of council's spend in CapEx across category. Most of the work that we do is horizontal, so that's projects that are on or below the ground. A small part of that is vertical, what we build above the ground, and then a lot of technical services around preparation to get to those projects underway. And in particular, you know, we're hearing a lot of media commentary around escalations in building projects, but a lot of that is aimed around the residential construction market, in which we don't really have a large role to play. So next slide, please. Just an example of some of the volatility in steel prices. You can see that large spike to do with initial COVID lockdowns and then a large drop. But then you're seeing the forecast for a spike again, and that's due to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. A lot of it is supply chain driven. We expect to see some flattening over the years, but still, what we expect to see is it's still outstripping the inflationary pressures. Next slide, please. Another story here, concrete and quarrying. We have seen sharp price increases since the COVID pandemic began. But the interesting thing is that this is all local. So it's not, we can't blame supply chain and geopolitical disruptions, but it is locally based inflation, which is still expected to rise quite strongly. Next slide, please. And of course, the well-signaled one around workers, particularly in the construction sector, we're seeing quite a lot of increase in the construction cost and labour in the construction. But we're also seeing what was flat in terms of professional services costs now starting to increase as well. Next slide, please. So just, I guess, a mix of slides here around cost escalations overall. So how does these input costs that I've just been talking about, how do they impact on output costs? So what a project actually costs. So we're seeing, quite sharp increases in the horizontal construction output index, but a flattening over the years. Roading is something that Auckland Transport will have mentioned, but input costs like bitumen have had quite a big impact on their output costs. Design engineering services, this will be really largely related to professional staff costs over the years. And in vertical, as I've talked about, we're seeing a large spike, or expect to see a large spike over the next year or so, and then flattening out after that. Next slide, please. Might be a bit of a confusing one where it seems like it's increasing then decreasing, but just trying to demonstrate that in FY23 year, we're seeing quite a large projected increase over budget, but that then becomes the new baseline for FY24. And as I've mentioned, in that baseline, we're going to see some reductions as some of those input pressure costs start coming off. So with that, on the next slide, I'm going to hand over to Taryn just to talk about how that's impacting on some actual projects underway and what some of the mitigations are.
Thank you, Jazz. So we've just picked two examples. There are numerous examples across the portfolio that we could refer to, but just to demonstrate how we're working not only with procurement but with our suppliers and across our project management staff to look at mitigating and also learning from some of the experiences we're seeing on the ground. You might be familiar with the use of our early contract involvement model. So we're using that on Tawhai Pathway, and we've just signed up for Avondale Community Centre as well. And that contract model is proving to be quite a good way of working with our suppliers. It allows us to work collaboratively and also manage the cost escalation and supply chain. And effectively what that means on the ground and in practice is because we're working much closer with our designers through that detailed design phase, we're able to adjust where we're seeing the increase in the supply markets or delays in timing of supply. But we're also able to, in real time, use some of the value engineering techniques while we're going through the design phase rather than going back while we're in construction. Quite a good example of this. The other point was just around the material selection. It's giving us the opportunity to also be able to pre-order and get the materials at a much lower cost. A good example of that is the Tawhai Pathway. So we managed to order steel, and if you recall back on Jazz's slide, the steel prices in December 21 were probably at their lowest compared to the forecast. We managed to get all the steel for Tawhai Pathway and for the pilings all ordered and secured at a very low rate, which has helped mitigate a significant cost increase that could have blown out on Tawhai. And in the last week, we've just taken delivery of that steel. So it's great to know we've got it and it's all ready for that project. We have had to learn through some of the projects, and Browns Bay Boardwalk has been one of the projects where we did have to take away some learnings. We saw a significant price increase from the time we designed the boardwalk to when we were available to, when the material was available to actually deliver the project, and we saw significant time delays in getting the timber for that boardwalk to complete the project. It is being completed now in June, but that has meant additional costs for that project around demobilising, remobilising, increased wages with the extension of time, and having to hold the site when the materials weren't on site. So from that, what we're doing is continually adapting our project management approach, looking to rather delay the site establishment and start of those projects, and making sure that we've got commitment of the materials, that they're either in the country or we know that they're imminent in the next couple of weeks before we start that site establishment. That way we avoid any of those additional costs around the remobilisation. And I think the areas just to note is that we're continually looking at what local supply is out there, with so many impacts on material supply, not only the timeliness of getting it into the country, but also the pricing. We've really investigated further in terms of that local supply, and are seeing some really great innovative products and opportunities out there that we can start leaning into. So in essence, I suppose just continuing to adapt the procurement approach and our project management approach as best we can to keep mitigating the costs. I'll hand over now to Karuna, who's going to update on performance measures.
Thank you very much, Jazz and Taryn. So in Q3, we had 24 performance measures that were updated, and of these, as you can see on the slide, 12 are achieved or substantially achieved their targets. Stormwater's been consistently performing well with all 5 measures, even in light of the significant storm event in late March that saw 600 requests for service alone. For the 12 that were not achieved, these related mainly to the local and regional community service performance measures, and these continue to be significantly impacted by COVID-19, and of course, as Ross mentioned at the start, further exacerbated with Omicron. Our resource and building consent statutory timeframes were also impacted by COVID-19, but in addition, there was also the increased volume and complexity of consents, and a backlog from the Christmas period, which the team have been working through. And as mentioned earlier, we do have Ian to talk more on this later. If we move along to some of the quarter's highlights, to the next slide, please. So despite visitor numbers to regional parks reducing in February and March, and of course the inclement weather, there was still over 2 million visits in the quarter, and we are reaching, as you can see there, record visitation numbers this financial year. So we have had over 5 million visits for the 9 months to March. So that's been great. Also, customer satisfaction targets across many of our services were met despite the impacts of COVID-19. And where there are challenges, there are initiatives in place to improve future performance, such as in the resource consents. And as you can see up there, the resource consents issued are at a record 6-year high. So at this point, it is a good place to hand over to Ian Smallburn to talk more about this. Thanks, Ian. Over to you.
Thank you, Karuna. Kia ora sato. Hello, everyone. I'm going to give a bit of an overview of our operational performance. We have been under a wee bit of pressure over the last few months, and give you an outline of what we're trying to do to get on top of the incoming volumes in the backlog. So this first graph, really to provide a bit of context on our lodged volumes. So the light blue line is for our current year, and the dark blue is the previous year. So in short, probably from about September 2020, our consent volumes started to increase quite significantly. And you'll see there sort of April 21, May 21, they're quite significant numbers all the way through until November 2021 last year, at the back end of last year. That was actually our highest incoming month for consents since the unitary plan came into being 6 years ago. So we are seeing unprecedented volumes. However, you'll see in sort of March 2022 and April just gone, those numbers are starting to soften slightly. There's probably 2 reasons for that. One is that the market, but also I suspect that applicants are waiting in anticipation for the plan change in late August, where greater intensification will be allowed. So we're anticipating in August a bit of an uplift again. Next slide, please. This slide talks to lodged consents versus completed consents. So the blue is lodged and the orange is completed. Again, sort of April, May, June last year, you'll see that we weren't being able to cope with the incoming volume, which created a significant backlog and work in progress. And I've got some numbers on that in a minute. Again, though, you'll see March, April just gone. We're starting to see more consents going out than coming in. Again, as we've started to put some initiatives in place to deal with the backlog, and obviously the dropping off of volumes as well. The lodged numbers aren't as high. Next slide, please. So if I focus on the work in progress in the middle segment there, the bottom box is in July last year, our work in progress. So this is the consents that are in the system being considered. We were at 5,600 in February this year. At our peak, we were 6,800, just over. And over the last few months, we've managed to dip into that backlog a little bit and get it down to 6,600. So we are making small steps, but it is quite positive in that March just gone. So I'll get it right. March just gone was the highest consenting output for a month for the last 6 years. So that's essentially the backlog that came through in October, November that we've managed to now deal with and get them out of the door. So that was the highest month for 6 years. What that does, though, is because we've got a significant work in progress, it does affect our statutory time frame. So top left-hand column there, you'll see last year we were in the 70% within 20 working days within our time frames, and that's dropped to 65, 63 in March, and it's back up to 65 for April. The reason for that is that the time frames are essentially a bit of a lag between in relation to the volume. So we have still got an allocated backlog, which is quite large, and it's taking 4 to 6 weeks to allocate consent. So if you're allocating a consent, say that's on day 20, it's obviously very hard to meet your statutory time frame, which is 20 working days. So, but we're working through that with a number of efficiencies and initiatives, as I say, and some of the results of that are in the middle segment at the top. So our internal planners back in September were processing 2.2 consents a week. In December, that's 2.6, and in March, we've gone up to 2.8. So we are gaining more efficiencies through our internal planners. Next slide, please. So this is a reasonably busy slide, but I'll just provide a summary of the initiatives that we've got in place, working from left to right. And this has been over the last 6 to 9 months as we deal with the backlog. So in the recruitment and retention space, we are still trying to recruit heavily. We've just gone out to the overseas market, given the border restrictions are loosening up somewhat. We've had 21 applicants that we're about to interview, mainly from South Africa, the States and the UK. So hopefully we'll get some good candidates to come out of that. We've got a dedicated talent acquisition consultant. So basically that's someone that chases up shoulder taps and tries and encourage people to apply for roles within council. We are looking at retention, keeping what good staff we've got. And part of that has been looking at salaries and making sure they're comparable to the market. In terms of the backlog updates, that's essentially a backlog team made up of 21 external consultants that are working solely on the backlog, basically getting more consultant resource to deal with the volumes. The next column, MOS, stands for Management Operating System. It's a bit of a fancy term for structured one-on-ones, basically. So what we're doing there is having regular catch-ups with our planners and specialists, setting expectations, monitoring performance, and using the reports that we can from our SAP system to improve productivity. We've also got a pipeline of reports that we're looking to work on over the next wee while to get better information out of the system and better intelligence. The fourth column there is regulatory support. So we've just had 14 additional FTEs put into the regulatory support team. They will undertake data entry for the planners and specialists. That has two added benefits. One is accuracy of data, and you'll probably be aware that we have struggled in that space for a little while. So with having a dedicated team who will have familiarity with the process and the systems will aid with that accuracy. But what it also does, it takes the sort of administrative work away from the planners and specialists so that they can focus on their technical work and processing consents. Proportionality, this is really more about mindset and culture. As you know, resource consents are considered on a case-by-case basis. Each resource consent is different. So what we're trying to do is to get people to focus on the key issues on a consent and not sweat the small stuff, not get involved in too much detail. So we've undertaken a number of training modules regarding this over the last 6 months. We've worked with specialists. We're about to work with asset owners. And we've started to record and measure the productivity rates, as I mentioned earlier, 2.2 in September a week, up to 2.8 in March a week. The customer response area is around pre-application meetings. So we've actually paused the majority of our pre-app service at the moment whilst we're focusing on the incoming consents and our core business. Previously, if you requested a pre-app meeting, you essentially got one. What we're looking to do is segment that and be a little bit more targeted. So if it means a phone call, an email, use of the website, specialist only meetings, all the way through to full meetings, not each proposal is the same, so we can tailor our response a little bit better there. And then the final column there, you're all aware of the plan change that's coming in late August. It will have a significant impact on us. We've got 6 work streams set up. So providing input into the plan change itself, working with plans and places. A big part of it will be training and guidance, given the technicalities of legal effect and weighting, through to making sure that our templates, our application forms, our documentation is updated, through again to comms as well, so to the development industry and the wider community on the impacts that the plan change will bring about. So that is quite a significant piece of work for us. Next slide, please. So these are just some key comments, really key takeaways. So we are under significant pressure due to large volumes from the back end of 2021 and the backlog that's created. We are making a bit of a dip into the backlog due to the recent improvements and the slight drop in lodged consents. We have got a work program. I've just touched on a few of the immediate ones there. We've got some longer term initiatives that we're working on. So improving our integration with asset owners. We're aware that that's a customer pain point. Some IT changes, so visibility of consents both for the public and our partners, our specialists. So better information will allow for quicker decision making, and we'll continue to focus on the proportionate decision making, making sure we're focusing on the right things. And finally, as I've mentioned, the change in legislation and the plan change will have an impact, both from a volume point of view, I suspect, but also the fact that we'll be working with two rule books, the plan change and the operative unitary plan version. That just adds complexity given the newness and the freshness of the provisions that we'll be dealing with and the complexity that brings. So we are making improvements, but there's still work to do. And happy to take any questions as I suspect the team are. Thank you.
I'm so used to this speaking at home. Thank you very much. There's a lot in there, so I'll open now for questions from the whole team. Councillor Hills. Oh, sorry. Councillor Hills, okay, and then I'll go Councillor Casey.
Kia ora, thank you, Chair. Just on the, to Ian there, do you have an approximate number of how many extra FTE we've needed over the last couple of years or even recently to cover that major increase in consenting? Just because we talk about it a lot that we've needed to add more, but I don't have a sort of quantum.
Yeah.
It's quite a dramatic uplift of work.
Yeah, so previously last year we had an FTE number within the department at 330. Currently we're sitting at about 315, and we had a business case approved to take that up to 385, which we felt was a number that could deal with the volume. However, as you're aware, the market is very tight, so the demand for planners is extremely high, but the supply is low, so it's really hard to fill those positions.
Thank you.
Thank you to Councillor. Councillor Casey, question from you.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. It's a question for Ross way back at the beginning. Ross, can you tell me what the new date or time is from Ports of Auckland for the completion of the automation project?
Sorry, I don't have that information. We'll have to ask Ports for that. We just know I'm aware it's been delayed. I don't know if others on the call have got any further information. It's kind of later in the year is kind of as much as I know. So we can ask that, although operational decisions are for Ports of Auckland and their board to make. But we can ask for an update unless anyone else here has got any information.
Through you, Chair, it's Pramod here. So my understanding is the project is likely to be delayed to the end of this calendar year or early in the new calendar year. My understanding is that this would likely be covered in the CCO oversight meeting when Ports present their quarterly report. It's probably a question for them.
Thanks, Pramod.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Walker, next question from you. Councillor Walker, are you there?
Sure, just migrating as you do from Nexus to Teams takes a moment. I've got a few questions. One is just around revenue. I understand the immense emphasis we place on reducing costs, but do we have a strategy and a similar exercise around increasing revenue, particularly the non-rates revenue that we get from venues, that we get from Auckland transport fares, and so on? So what's our strategy around that? And is there any room for movement there?
Okay, I'll start. I might pass to Nicola or Taryn to talk about some of the venues and the community space. Across the group, obviously, Watercare have their own pricing strategy, and there's decisions made on that related to the capital program. Within public transport, the strategy there is kind of people are thinking about getting people back onto PT. We've currently got half-price PT fares with government support. So that is a hard space to kind of ramp up PT fares to increase revenue, while at the same time we're looking to drive different outcomes there. Other areas, like in the regulatory stuff we just talked about, the basis of the revenue is all cost recovery. So we can only recover the costs. We can't increase revenue to the point where we're kind of making a profit or a surplus. So across the larger parts of the non-rates revenue, there are constraints and other factors that makes it hard to increase revenue. I don't know if, in terms of venues, some of our venues and services, maybe if Taryn or Nicola want to respond to that. Claudia.
Shall I go first, Claudia? I wanted to talk, thanks Ross, just more broadly. So we are kicking off a revenue strategy or project across the council parent, and we're looking at 3 aspects of revenue. So the first one is revenue assurance, which is where that's really about making sure that all of the revenue that we are entitled to, that we are actually charging for it and receiving it. So that's kind of a housekeeping aspect. Then we're looking at of the things that we currently charge for or earn revenue from, what are the things we could do more of? So what works well that we could expand? We might offer something in one place and see opportunities to offer that somewhere else. And the third aspect is looking at any new revenue opportunities. So that's a bit of kind of blue sky brainstorming, and the concept really is thinking of the assets that we own, how could we get more out of them, what opportunities might exist. So that's the approach that we're taking. It's pretty tough and it's kind of small incremental things, but it's definitely worth working towards improvements. So Claudia, maybe you've got some examples to add.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you for being with us today. So in addition to the comments that have just been raised, there's a few other things that we believe are opportunities for us to look into, and papers will be coming to relevant committees where that also is something that's going to be helpful for us to consider in more detail. So this includes some of our pricing levers, including regarding the leasing of our current facilities or any fees and charges. And we do recommend that these aspects are looked into so that we have some greater consistency across our organisation and also greater equity for some of our communities who use our services. And lastly, we are being supported by our marketing teams who are helping drive through traffic to some of our services who faced revenue shortfalls as a result of COVID and Omicron in general. We've seen lower attendances at some of our facilities, such as pools and leisure, some of our venues for hire. That has, of course, impacted our revenue this year. We've been working very proactively to make sure that our costs are managed as tightly as possible to mitigate those financial impacts. But now that our services have been able to reopen as soon as they could, we've been putting a lot more emphasis on marketing and growth at some of our sites. So hopefully many of our elected members will be seeing those marketing activities underway as well. Thank you.
Okay, so just a further question. Given that we have a target-based approach around cost savings, do we have a target-based approach around revenue increase? And if so, what is that for the next quarter? How does that apply across the group? And if there is a marketing plan for that, I'd really like to see it, thanks. So what's our target for the next quarter for a revenue increase? Do we have one?
I can speak to the approach for council parent, Councillor Walker, and what we are looking at is the 90 million target that we currently have. We're thinking of it more as a bottom line improvement target. So while it will largely come from operating cost savings, it may also come from revenue improvements. So we're looking at the kind of the net, if you like. So we're not planning to have a separate revenue target. We're planning to use the revenue improvements to contribute towards the current 90 million target.
I have another question just as it goes to cost going forward, Madam Chair. And that was highlighted by a speaker earlier as a consequence of the government's housing legislation that comes into effect in August. Given that that legislation enables development to occur of a significantly higher intensity almost everywhere, and we can anticipate that that will impact on local infrastructure, that is local sewage, water, stormwater pipelines, then into the larger feeder pipelines, and the related issue that there is no requirement for a resource consent. I'll repeat that. My understanding is no requirement for a resource consent, which under ordinary circumstances might pick up issues around infrastructure. How are we going to budget for that? And do we have any idea of what the scope is of, I would anticipate, the many, many millions of dollars that this is going to cause across our organisation? So is there some risk analysis, some budgeting around that? Thank you.
So I guess with those factors that you've raised, I guess it's very early days. There's a lot of uncertainty around how that plays out. The way that we're thinking about that is the first step is re-looking at the development strategy, and I understand there's been workshops or will be workshops on that commencing very soon. That will then lead to infrastructure planning, infrastructure strategies, asset management planning. So that is all work that we need to do to understand what is the impact of all of that, those new regulations and what can be done on infrastructure planning. So it's really something that's going to need to do quite a bit of work, and then that will feed through into the next, probably the next council's LTP, and then after that it'll flow through to things like budgeting, budget decisions and development contribution updates as some of those costs and infrastructure requirements become clearer and better understood.
Through you, Madam Chair, just a supplementary.
As long as it's
This
relating to the,
legislation-
hold on, councillor, as long as it's
Very-
related to Q3 results, because that's the purpose of this agenda item. Your questions are valid, but they're valid for looking forward. What we're doing at the moment in this particular item is looking for questions around our Q3 results.
And yes, I understand that, Madam Chair, but you would have noted yourself in all of the graphs that all of the graphs and the commentary is both historical and forward orientated. Every item has noted that. I am challenging some of that information and suggesting that as of August, which is not far away, that's August this year, we may well face compounding costs across our organisation, of which we have known about for well over a year now in terms of preparing for this. So I'm just asking what the risk analysis is, what the budgeting is that has been done. If it hasn't happened, fine. The officers can just say, well, we don't know, and we're not really planning for it. We're going to wait until the bus hits us. But I am raising this as a significant issue that goes to our costs. So I'll just leave that there. The other question that I've got just goes to the forecast costs for materials, particularly both steel and concrete that you mentioned, and the related issue that we have around our emissions in New Zealand, the very, very high sunk carbon emissions in both steel and concrete, and the escalating costs of emissions, and whether or not those factors have been taken into account into your projections.
Ross? I think I will just repeat. Oh, Ross, do you want to?
Sorry. Oh no, yeah. I mean, I was just going to say that those are, I think, some of the factors that Jazz has talked about with those trends. I'm not sure about the the carbon component of that. But what at the moment we've got budget projections for capex. I guess the standard approach we're working to is there's no additional funding available, so it's kind of working within those budgets, and it might mean that as costs increase, some projects will be delivered over a longer time period. So it's kind of working within capital programs and envelopes and dealing with those challenges. I don't know if Jazz wants to comment or if there's, I can't really answer the bit around the carbon element.
Madam Chair, I was just going to say that all of those, as Ross has mentioned, we'll work through in our existing programs, and we'll have to ensure that structures around our projects and plans and even our OPEX spend are targeted so that we take into account any costs associated with emissions reductions, etc.
Thank you. Councillor Newman, your question now, please.
Thank you, Chair. I had a question. I don't know if is someone from Healthy Waters available to answer questions with respect to the impact of slowing down or deferred renewals in the Healthy Waters space? Is somebody available for that?
I've just been told we don't believe we have, but we can take a question away.
Okay, well, I'll direct that question directly to Healthy Waters, Chair. I mean, it's difficult to be able to determine the merits of slowing down the renewals program when the officers aren't available to answer that. But okay, so well, if Ian Smallburn's still on the call, my question relates to recruitment of staff in that space. Ian, are we still actively recruiting in overseas markets for skilled building scientists, practitioners who work in this space? And when we do, are we in a position to offer them a path to residency, or is this a temporary employment contract on the basis of a 3-year work visa program? And what is it that Auckland Council is able to offer, given the current immigration environment, for those qualified practitioners?
Yeah, so we are looking to recruit overseas, and in my conversations with the people and capability team, my understanding on the immigration rules and procedures has changed slightly, in that previously a lot of the onus was on the individual, the employee, to organise the necessary visas, etc. Whereas now that onus is shifting to council to support and undertake that. That's about the level of detail I know. I would also add that we do offer relocation packages, so paying for the shipment of belongings, paying for the first 4 weeks or a certain period of time for accommodation. So we do offer relocation packages as well.
Ian, I guess, and you might not be able to answer this, but if you could take this question away if you can't, I guess what I'm curious to know is that, I mean, we're at the end of a very, very long supply chain where there's a lot of competition, so I can understand you targeting that overseas market, but it's really the most attractive thing that we can offer people, I guess, is a permanent residency pathway. And I'm just unclear at the moment, given policy settings, if it is a permanent residency or if it's a 3-year working visa pathway with no option to be able to become a permanent resident. So can you, if you can't answer that, that's fine, but can you get that information for me?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to look into that.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cashmore. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, 2 questions. The first going to the cost of projects, and the example of the Browns Bay Boardwalk was given to us in terms of escalation of the prices of the wood being used in that project. My question is a generic one, but it might equally apply to the Browns Bay situation. After these kind of wood-related projects are completed, and often, you know, they can be quite expensive or exotic timbers that are used in them, is there an automatic pickup in the maintenance regime as far as it goes to staining or oil preservation? And I say that because I look around a number of centres in in my ward that have, you know, what are initially very attractive looking wood finishes and facilities or amenities of one sort, and then they deteriorate quite quickly, and then we end up in a situation, I guess, down the line like Browns Bay, where there's significant rotting and they need to be replaced. So my question in that first instance, is there an automatic correlation between wood-related projects and then then the automatic signalling of a maintenance regime that goes to those particular woods in particular?
Sure, I can pick that question up through the chair. So yes, Councillor Watson, as part of the handover of the project as we complete it, part of the handover is working with the contractors on what the maintenance regime needs to be on any asset that is completed. So we do factor that in, and for our new builds or major refurbishments, we also take the cost of the maintenance into account at the planning stage to look at that whole of life costing around what's the best materials to be using, or the best design to be using to minimise our costs going forward, particularly with the sustainability lens as well. So to answer your question, yes, that is factored in and is planned for as part of our maintenance going forward.
Okay, thank you. Second question goes to the increase of 443 full-time equivalent employees, and I guess specifically the Auckland Council component of that, 185. We're told that that comes, mainly from filling of vacancies in the first instance, but also for new climate change related goals, and also for work that comes as a consequence of having to fulfil, the government directives in 3 waters, and I assume in the housing legislation as well. Are we in a position to quantify in the first instance exactly how many people have been employed as a consequence of those government-related impositions? And secondly, in the instance of the climate change-related roles, how many of them are directly tied to behavioural change as opposed to policy matters?
Through you, Chair, Richard Jarrett, Director of Group Services. I haven't got the detail for you on that specific question, but what I can say for some context is that the FTE for Auckland Council is within the CEO agreed range. June 2021 does look lower than March 2022. If you look back over the last 3 years since June 2019, Auckland Council's FTE has held flat over those last 3 years despite the growing population and increased demand on services that you spoke to and members of council spoke to earlier, Ross, Taryn, Ian, etc. But I can make sure we come back with the specific questions on the detail that you're looking for.
Okay, so thanks, Madam Chair. So that's quite important, I guess, in the first instance, in the correlation between government-imposed work that the council is now having to pick up. So that's useful information. And secondly, in terms of the climate change, I guess, personally, I'm very interested in how these new roles relate or actually translate to real and immediate change of behaviour, as opposed to the more policy orientated emphasis that certainly I've picked up to date. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Next question, Councillor Collins.
Awesome, thanks, Chair, and apologies, I'm in and out a bit because I've got some challenges with my connection, so hopefully this holds out. I've got 3 questions. One is, someone mentioned earlier in the discussion that there was a revenue strategy or revenue approach being developed by the finance team. I may have missed it, Chair, but do we have a sense or know when that is due, or when that will that come back to this committee?
Nicola? Are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for your question, Councillor Collins. The types of things included in the revenue strategy are, I guess, incremental operational improvements more that we're envisaging, but we can certainly include some reporting on it in our future quarterly reports, if that would be helpful.
Okay, sorry. I thanks for that, Nicola. And I was thinking it was going to be a bit more general or wider scoped than that. But that's good to know. Thanks, Nicola. I may have misinterpreted what was said. The other couple of questions I have is, I'm not sure if this fits under procurement, Pramod, and the strategy that's being approached there, but I'm interested in, when I'm doing a bit of a comparison around FTEs, the growth filling spaces, and perhaps what we're not doing in the consultancy space that is picking up work that otherwise would have been FTEs. Do we have a sense of what that division of spend might be?
Good question. Who's going to take that? Because that's what's happened in the regulatory space. We used to contract out, and if we employ them to do the volume, but who's going to? There we go. Jazz.
I can pick that up, Madam Chair. I don't have exact numbers, but what I can say is that we're not really seeing a massive difference from what we had sort of pre-COVID to what we have now. There are some roles that are particularly difficult to fill that we may have our suppliers helping us with, but where they are permanent ongoing roles, those contracts are very short term, so we don't have those, or our intention is not to have contractors in those roles for longer than 12 months, so we don't have long-term contracts. But at this stage, we're not seeing a very large transition from FTE to contractors as such, and it's something in terms of our contingent workforce that we monitor quite closely, work with PNC to ensure that we don't have too much reliance on their contingent workforce.
Brilliant, thank you. And just my final question, Chair, and this, I'm happy for you to say it belongs somewhere else, but earlier on in Ross's presentation, he talked about some of the delayed projects, and one of them that was noted, this may pick up a little bit from what Councillor Casey asked earlier, was around the delay in the automation project at the ports of Auckland. And I was just wondering if and this might not be a finance question, but given some of the safety concerns that have been held that we're all aware of with the ports, if delaying that part, the automation part, is is wise, given the safety concerns that many would hold right throughout the city, and whether we're at a point where we need a full report back as to what the cost benefits are of automation, given the challenges that are obviously being had at the ports of Auckland. So I'm not sure if this question belongs here, Chair. It might be a CCO review committee question, but I thought I'd put it to you as well. Okay.
Thank you. It's a good question, and Bill's listening, so I'll make sure it's picked up in the next CCO Oversight Committee. Thank you, Councillor.
Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Sayers. Greg, can you hear me? Councillor Fletcher, are you there?
Yes, I am, Madam Chair. Thank you. Under the third quarter review that we're considering and the 5.2 million park attendance numbers, I was wondering whether officers could comment on the pressure that might have put on park infrastructure, examples being toilets, parking, and ranger services. I just wonder whether there is a commentary available by officers on the implications of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to pick that up? Karen?
Kia ora. I could probably pick up on some of the impacts with regards to the maintenance. I'm not too sure about the impacts on the rangers, but across our facilities, we did see additional cleaning required across, particularly in our regional parks and our coastal facilities. So that did see a number of increases, I suppose, in the requests for service, and in some instances complaints over that summer period, which was understandable. But I know the contractors did respond quite well and increase their cleaning regimes quite quickly. There was also, we'll know, along certain coastal areas in particular, we did start to see a bit of illegal camping and overnight staying, and so we've been working quite closely with the parks team as well as our regulatory team just to look at measures of how we can manage that better, because we had new areas pop up this year that we haven't had to deal with in the past, and the teams did respond as quickly as possible. But as you can imagine, with the number of people out in our parks and enjoying the open spaces, that was a bit of a challenge. But on a whole, I think most of the services just really pivoted to where we were seeing those busy areas, and we're trying to cope with that.
Thank you. Just a supplementary to that. So there were no health and safety related issues related to parking in particularly popular spots, or issues around sanitation and health and safety issues with the lack of toilet type infrastructure. You have no records of that?
Claudia, were you jumping on to answer?
So kia ora. So through you, Madam Chair, thank you very much for the question. So we have become aware, gosh, over several months now, of health and safety concerns that our teams have experienced. We are observing that members of our community can be, sometimes working in a more challenging way with some of our staff, and we're paying a very close eye on what we need to do better to support our teams. So for many of our large parks in particular, where we've seen higher attendances by members of the public, particularly during summer, we have put in security services to support our teams, and we're working closely with security organisations to ensure that they also have the capacity to help support our teams too, and that they're doing so in the best way. In many of those instances, the services are excellent. In some instances, we've seen some gaps that we're working very closely with our contractors to close, and the gaps that they've experienced, of course, have also sometimes been as a result of COVID. So we're working very closely at an end-to-end standpoint to ensure that our teams are as safe as possible. But there are some hotspots that we are aware of, and we're closely monitoring that, including with our colleagues in our Central Health and Safety team. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to foreshadow that this is something that I would like to keep a close eye on. And we're very lucky to have Scott Silva, who's managing these regional parks. But there are some shortfalls that I'm aware of, and it's something that I might follow up with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'm sure you can address it too in Councillor Filippona's committee, so thank you for that. Councillor Sayers, are you still there or not?
I am, Madam Chair. My question has been answered, so thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thank you. Look, people, I just want to, could you bring the resolutions up, please? I've added some Chair's resolutions, highlighting the positives, as I want to try to do in this very financially challenging times. So there's nothing in the resolutions that isn't in the paper. Just waiting for the team to bring it up. We might just have a 5-minute technological break. Hold the line, please. We'll be back soon.